We'd like to start with two quotes. The first one is by Albert Camus. I'll read that, then Adam will read the second one. A step lower, a strangeness creeps in, perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, this very minute, lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second, we cease to understand it, because for centuries we have understood it in a solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand. Because henceforth, we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. That stage scenery, masked by habit, becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us.
And the next one is from Frank Herbert, the author of Dune. Deep in the human unconsciousness is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic.
Yes, and with those two quotes, we'll engage in this conversation, which will be both a conversation and a presentation.
Yes.
If you hand me the little gadget there, I'll just put on. Oops, one point back. But I'll start by saying something about why we sit here on the stage together, why we chose to do it. Because what we're talking about today is the result of a long process and the beginning of a new process, I guess you could say. It all started out, actually, when was you invited me to talk at a seminar at Medical Museum?
2 years ago?
2 years ago, on the theme of the Anthropocene. And I, of course, wanted to participate, but was also a little reluctant to come and talk about the Anthropocene. At the time I was working with disasters, and the Anthropocene and disasters are very close connected phenomena. But I didn't want to do yet another talk about how horrible the world is. So I chose to come up with this idea of strange ecology as a way of talking about the Anthropocene in another way, particularly through art. And that resonated really well with some ideas that you had.
Yes, partly when we were in the process of making this exhibition, which I'll talk about in a second, called Mind the Gut, which engages, in a sense, some of the strange ecologies that actually have turned out to live inside all of us. So there was a kind of resonance across themes that felt like we could make something out of a shared concern with strangeness, basically.
Right. And then actually Adam inspired me so much to go on with this concept that it turned into an exhibition, which is the one I'll be talking about in a little while. And then I don't know if I inspired you or you had already commenced on your exhibition, but anyways, you curated Mind the Gut. And somehow these two exhibitions is what we are trying now to have intercourse between in some way.
Yes.
And I applied for some grant money to work at the Medical Museum, and I just started 2 weeks ago. And we are now working on a next level of both Mind the Gut and Strange Ecologies. So far the working title is Strange Bodies, and I'm sure there'll be some strange bodies in the talk here today, so you get somewhat an idea of what it is. Hopefully also us, because it's early in the process. We don't have a finished exhibition yet, but we have a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions, a lot of ideas. So I hope you will indulge with us in some of these questions. And we also took this format to allow you to basically just ask questions as we go along rather than have to wait until the end. So if there's something along the way that you feel needs clarification or specification, please just interrupt. I think we can both handle that. So we get a more kind of informal conversation across the themes.
Yes, and I guess you could say Jakob and I are sort of having a conversation going on right now, so we thought we'd kind of invite all of you to participate in that and give us your input as we go.
Adam, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, so the way we'll do it is we'll just briefly take 10 minutes each and present our exhibitions, so you get a sense of some of the work we've done and the input we put into that, and then we'll present some possible future examples taken from our different interests and show you those, and somewhere along the line we'll get to talk a bit more about strangeness and ecologies and the Anthropocene and all of that. And as Jakob has already said it, but I just reiterate, please join the conversation as we go. We can happily monopolize for an hour, it's not a problem, but please join in if you have something to add. So what I'll do is talk about the work that went into Mind the Gut. I will just spend about half of it talking about the topic and another half talking about the process that went into that. So, as Henne said, I work at the Medical Museum, which is the university's museum for the culture and history of medicine, located in Overgaden. Interestingly, we're a university museum, so we're part of the university, which means that we, in our positions, have both curatorial and research duties. So it's not like we have a kind of front of house staff and a research staff. We combine that in individual positions. So I do both curatorial work, make exhibitions, and I do research and write peer-reviewed papers, and so travel both of those boundaries. We have exhibitions like these. This is one we opened a couple of years ago called The Body Collected, collections of human remains, and stretching from fetuses in jars up into biobanks and blood samples. Now, the beginning of this exhibition, Mind the Gut, which just opened earlier in October, these are two of the posters that we made, I should maybe say that the start of that process was that we in 2015 won the Bikubenfonden Vision Award. So this established museum award. It used to be retrospective, so you could win for an exhibition that you'd already made. But then they changed it to a much more sympathetic Vision Award, in which you could send in a concept and actually win money to build something, which was amazing for a house like us that doesn't really have an exhibition budget. You can actually dream something up, and if you're fortunate enough, you could win money to build it. And it's 3 million kroner, so it's a reasonable amount of money. We won that first round of that award with a concept called Mind the Gut, studying gut-brain bacteria interaction research, and engaging that through an interdisciplinary process, which I'll outline in a second. Winning that was a very happy moment. We kind of high-fived every morning for 6 months in our offices, and it led to a lot of phone calls because we are a fairly small and not very well-known museums. We're getting there. We're kind of stepping up our activities, but it's been we've been unknown for a while. But the topic itself engages a lot of the biomedical research that's done at the university and within our faculty, trying to understand what's called the gut-brain microbiome axis. So basically, the research says, in fact, we used to think of the body as a kind of complex or a sort of a collection of subsystems. So there's a brain that thinks, and there's a gut that digests like a machine, and there's a heart that pumps. But in fact, it turns out that these systems are much more integrated. And in fact, a part of that integration involves microorganisms that aren't even us. Right? So they live inside all of you. They live on your skin, in your genitals, in your mouth. You have about 1 kilo maybe in your gut, depending on how you measure it. And they lie somewhere on that axis. And so maybe we have to start figuring in that ecosystem into us to understand the sort of creatures we are. So science asks the sort of who are we question, right? So the we refers to the wild profusion of bacteria, fungi, and viruses that colonize the human body. These unseen passengers number in the trillions and contribute so much to human biology that it is difficult to say where the body ends and the microbes begin. It is a compelling new take on humankind's place in the world, a realization that who am I cannot be fully answered until it is fully understood who we are. Right? So there's a kind of shot at the bow of the Enlightenment subject, basically, and the idea that we look at nature, in fact, it lives inside of us, right? There isn't an environment that we can detach from, it's already inside of us. And not as a metaphor, not as a kind of image of a holistic comparison. No. Physical things that live inside of you, that produce chemicals that run you. Not as a kind of, or rather that run within the system that is you, right? We thought that was fun. And it leads to really trying to say we need a new vision of the subject, one that is more complicated, and one in which the real individual consists both of human and bacterial part. This is a group of evolutionary biologists saying, well, if individuality is a matter of being functionally integrated to the extent that the causality between the interacting parts may persist or cease when one of these parts is faced with an evolutionary pressure, we ought to consider for biological research purposes that the single Homo sapiens is not in fact the real biological individual, right? And it ends up, it is the integrated symbiotic association that is able to persist and survive, right? So for evolutionary reasons, it is human plus bacteria, that's the real individual, right? We have a long, complicated evolutionary relationship to them. This is evidenced by a sort of a whole host of facts, like the microbiome of the birth canal of pregnant women changes to contain more bacteria that are good at breaking down milk, right? So the pregnant body is evolutionarily preparing the infant to have further metabolic abilities through the bacteria. That's like deep symbiogenesis right there. And it leads to a number of Anthropocene-sounding metaphors for the body. Here's one from a group of researchers saying that when a new human being emerges from its mother, a new island pops up in microbial space. Although a human lifespan is a blink in evolutionary time, the human island chain has existed for several million years, and our ancestors stretch back over the millennia in a continuous archipelago. Right? So you get these geological, geographical, nature metaphors that suddenly encompass the human body. So we really explored this in a sense as a kind of what you could call an Anthropocene subject, or a microbial or post-human subject. One in which divides between nature and culture completely break down, one in which ideas about domination over and nature sitting from a side of you is somehow turned down. This is a quote from Catherine Hale's famous book on posthumanism, in which she writes about machines, but you could change a lot of this with bacteria. She says she wants to perform a different account of the post-human body, in which emergence replaces teleology, reflexive epistemology replaces objectivism, distributed cognition replaces autonomous will, embodiment replaces a body seen as a support system for the mind, and a dynamic partnership between humans and intelligent machines replaces the liberal humanist subject's manifest destiny to dominate and control nature, right? So you replace intelligent machines with bacteria, and you have a kind of microbial subject in which we're embedded in the world. So what we wanted to do with our exhibition was to try to make a complex exhibition with a complex process to match this complex body. And we wanted to tell stories about the strangeness of biomedical research, and we wanted to tell stories about just how, in fact, knowledge about the body comes about through these weird, open-ended processes. Right? On the right, you have living bacterial ecosystems, which are part of the exhibition. On the left, you have I think maybe I should just leave that one hanging so you can come to the exhibition and understand why there's a torso of a man with a hole in his body as part of the exhibition itself. It has connections to the history of metabolic research. But really, what we wanted to do with this was to make an exhibition that was neither art, nor cultural history, nor science. And so the way we did that was to say, okay, if we want to do that, because none of these can have an authoritarian disciplinary control over that subject, like gut-brain interaction, doesn't belong to either of those fields. So we have to invite people into our process. Right, so the way we did that was to make an open call for participants, saying, do you want to make an exhibition with us? No matter who you are. We got 160 applicants from all over the world, ended up selecting 3 very different artists and 2 scientists, and then we sat down around a table and said, what should we make? What should it be? We had the topic and we had the title and we had the spaces in the basement of the exhibition, but everything else was open. Yeah?
Are you guys normally just really a tight history of science institute, like a cultural history? Like how far are you getting away from your normal program?
We're a little bit of both. I mean, it is a very strong, it has a strong roots in the history of medicine. It's in a very historical building that has long connection to the history of medicine in Denmark. But we've also, because we wanted to, well, there was a decision made in the early 2000s to say, okay, everything that goes on in this house has to be about contemporary biomedicine. So it's not just a place where you come in and you kind of shiver at the past and go, oh my God, I'm happy for modern biomedicine, right? Which you can perfectly well do by putting up amputation kits and all of that. But because of that focus, that has led us into all kinds of strange avenues, right? Because biomedicine, for the most part, is a really bad exhibition topic. It's conceptually interesting, but for making spaces, it's just really poor. Like an amputation kit or a bloodletting equipment or a jar of leeches, man, that's good exhibition stuff, right? People look at it and they feel all kinds of things. But a gene chip or a one-use lab equipment is just not as interesting. So we began experimenting with art-science overlaps and more material aesthetic ways of thinking about exhibitions. So in a sense, it's both a deviation from our path, but it also builds on a history of experimentation within the house doing that.
You had art exhibitions in the house for what, 6-7 years?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. We began experimenting with that 5, 6, 7 years ago. We did an exhibition called Split and Splice in 2009, which won a big science award, which was curated by a Canadian art curator called Martha Fleming, and that was a kind of first move for us. And I think it made sense to examine these overlaps, because it felt like you could break out of that kind of history of science, dreariness, but without being just stepping back and letting artists run the place either. You get a little bit of traction between those two things.
And I think exactly there was this overlap that attracted me to go and, or wanted to go and work in this place, apart from kind of a straight up art institution, exactly to get into this complementary field where science and art is seen as existing on the same plane from the very beginning.
Yeah, and trying to explore that, and I guess a key moment for us was to say, okay, it has to be about taking seriously what it is to be a museum means to think about objects and materiality and aesthetics, and then you work from that. Mm-hmm. And then you can use artists because they're usually good at thinking about that. That was the idea. But what we then did with this process was, well, the 3 artists and the 2 scientists were, along with 5 curators from the house, with all kinds of technical and other obligations, sat down around the table and spent the first 6 months just talking, just kind of, what should it be? And without trying to get too anxious about the fact that we hadn't built anything yet, and just steel ourselves and just try to stick with the engagement as an important aspect of the process. And we really wanted to experiment with the kind of spaces that lie in between disciplinary authority. So rather than have an art part and a science part and a history part, we wanted to try and find ways of making things that had a little bit of all of that embedded in each part of the exhibition. We were inspired by researchers from England called Felicity Callard and Des Fitzgerald, who worked at the Wellcome Collection in London at the Wellcome Hub, which is a big interdisciplinary program, who talked about what they call experimental entanglements, and they had this notion of awkward intradisciplinarity, right? So it's not interdisciplinarity because it's not to establish discipline, having a conversation. It's it's the places in between the disciplines that you want to try to stick with and explore, no matter how awkward that is. They have this idea of the awkwardness, which I really like, that it's just, you don't feel quite comfortable because you talk a little bit out of your normal zone, but it's still, you have to insist on that because that's where something interesting happens. And then it became a way also of challenging the idea of the curator. Here's a quote from Anthology and Museum Experiments, in which they write that these experiments are a way of challenging the sacrosanct autonomy of a singular curatorial vision, which typifies the hierarchical structure of much exhibitionary practice, right? So we wanted to make an exhibition about a complex embedded body, which has microbial and human parts. So then mirroring that by having a kind of curator, a singular autonomous curator controlling everything, felt like exactly the opposite of the kind of subject we wanted to say something about. So that's why we went with this model. So we wanted to try to curate a complex subject and really a strange history of the body and explore those spaces. Yes?
Just hang on. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It's so big. It's just the awkward interdisciplinarity. Could you give me a reference for that?
Yes, they're called Felicity Callard and Des Fitzgerald. They worked at the Wellcome Collection in London, which some of you might know, medical kind of cultural medicine exhibition place, very big. They run a program called The Hub, which is a 2-year interdisciplinary program in which you get £1 million for 2 years to set up a research group that explores a topic from across many disciplines. The first run of that was called Hubbub, and it was about rest and quiet, and it was an engagement between social science and neuroscientists and poets and all kinds of stuff. But Wellcome is interesting because they have the world's largest pot of money. It's massive. They're the single largest private sponsors of biomedical research in the world. And then they have an interest in culture and history of medicine, so they can give £1 million to someone, and it's not, it doesn't dent their work. But they've written quite extensively on this topic, and it's extremely interesting and sort of wanting to stir up. They speak of the bloodless regime of interdisciplinarity. This sense in which people just, we want to do interdisciplinary stuff, and then they just sit and stay within their disciplines and kind of talk to each other, and then they step back and nothing has changed. Right? So they try to explore what happened. You have to stick with that field in between and see where that takes us. But basically, I'm going to end it at that I think, showing you the kind of some of the messiness that this is a piece or an installation within the exhibition that was done by an artist called Naja Ryd Ankerfeldt. We had her collaborate with researchers at KU and at Hvidovre Hospital, and she had biopsies taken of her intestines and her skin and MRI scans of her brain and her body, and she wove it together with images of her skin and satellite imagery of the Earth into a very large, and this is just it's actually a digital interactive map which you can zoom around on and move in and out. So you have this complex, messy body that's both real and imagined, and that's kind of what we wanted the exhibition to be also, a sort of in-between space consisting of not a singular authoritarian voice, but a more messy, complex exhibition for a more messy, complex body. I'll hand over to you, Jacob.
Thanks so much, Adam. Please go see the show. It's up for some time still, but for many years, I guess.
It's semi-permanent, so you don't have to rush.
But it's a real treat, and I think it's a real treat, especially in Copenhagen, where we don't have that many cultural history exhibition spaces, let alone exhibitions. So, a warm recommendation. The show I'm going to be talking about is over, so you can't go see that. But nevertheless, I'll give you a brief tour of it and talk a little about how it came about or some of the context for the show. It's called Strange Ecologies, and it took place in this space I was running out at Nørrebro here in Copenhagen for 2.5 years, called X and Beyond. The show opened, I think, last February. This February. Yeah, 2017. And the show, I can show some pictures here, was kind of a way of looking at different aspects of the imagination of nature, or nature imaginary, from a kind of a very broad perspective, involving quite a lot of different kinds of work. The exhibition space itself was also peculiar in the sense that it was started out as a university project where I worked with researchers from all the other 6 faculties at the University of Copenhagen, and we were all trying to come up with a way to talk about contemporary disaster society. So really making people more disaster literate, I guess you could say, realizing that to be disaster literate today means to be able to talk across disciplines. Disasters is not only a discipline for Hollywood movies, neither is it only a discipline for economics or lawyers. Also, it's the entanglement of all these disciplines that make us better at coping with disasters on the many levels that they challenge us: social, existential, political, economic, architectural, and so forth. But strange ecologies came at the sort of the end of my work within this research project called Changing Disasters. And at this point, I had come to one important realization as a curator, which was art is not going to save the world in the sense that it's not going to help the people who need emergency toilets during a flood in India, for instance. You have to be very humble and realistic about that. That's not the job of art. And that was a question I was asked very, very early on in the process, and something that kept with me. Like, what is it then that art can do in this context? So, as the project developed in the exhibition space, I became more and more attuned to what is it actually what is the power of the imagination, of the artistic imagination. And I began to look at ways that artworks had worked with disasters throughout media, throughout different time periods. And I put together this little show, had 4 different sections. One was called Cosmic Encounters, looking at the kind of the disastrous space that the Earth is part of. One up there you can see is called Media at Nature, looking at how our concept of media has some overlaps with our conception of biological life, how our metaphors from one field is used in the other, and back as kind of a mutual exchange. There were one called Planet Earth Revisited, basically looking at different kinds of fiction that took a very speculative approach to how what natural life was and what nature was on planet Earth. And then I had a last section called Environmental Architecture, looking at architects who are working with nature, kind of seeing nature as the teacher and human as the student. So trying to build architecture that was in, I wouldn't say harmony with nature, but what's built on principles of nature. And the kind of the preliminary thesis of this project, which is an exhibition, but it's also a concept, and it's also, I guess, a text at some point. But it's kind of just a notion I threw out there on the invitation of Adam, and it's kind of taken on, and I'm still not completely sure where it is at the moment, but there are some questions that I do know that I'm interested in, and this is one of them. So that strange ecologies takes as its point of departure the assessment that humans are part of something bigger than themselves, part of ecosystems which in time and space surpass human perception and existence, but also intelligence. And exactly this with the intelligence was important, because it's basically that there are points when we look at the natural world where we have to say, okay, this is not something for the rational mind, this is something for the artistic speculation.
I hope you can also see here where Jakob and I kind of met with this topic. There is a shared moment of looking at nature and realizing that you're part of it in a way that you weren't expecting to, perhaps, or that your subject position in relation to it is a different one.
Exactly. And then the other thing is, Strange Ecologies addresses the present age to challenge humans to reconsider and expand their understanding of and relation to the natural world beyond the horizon of the perceivable and the plausible. Going back to the Frank Herbert quote that you had in the beginning, Adam, that the true world always lies beyond logic. I think that's one of the premises to keep going towards that, or working from that premise. But then what I wanted to do is just like point to 5 contexts that was important for me working with this exhibition. One, which is probably the most Anthropocene in this context, the idea of man as exterminator and extinct. I've been very interested in nuclear culture, and especially Robert Oppenheim and his kind of struggling with being the inventor of the atom bomb. Here with the quote saying, "Now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds." That was really one idea that I think that the Anthropocene is really based on, this idea that man is the destroyer of world, not only with nuclear energy, nuclear bombs, but also with more prosaic, but nevertheless monstrous materials such as plastic, which I'll talk about later.
I can maybe add also to this. This context has a particular relevance for microbiome research, in which, of course, we're realizing that antibiotics functions as small nuclear bombs on our ecosystem, right? That the fact that when you take antibiotics, you don't just kill the pathogens, you don't just kill the bad bacteria, you kill all of it, and that might have much more effect, a longer-term effect on our systems that we anticipated. So it's this sense in which there's resonance between what we've done to the world outside of us and what we've done to the world inside of us. And you can see how extinction, in a sense, is a real part of everyday health concerns around the microbiome, because lowering diversity and lowering number of bacteria or of microorganisms in our guts, which is something that has happened in all Western societies over the past 50 years, is correlated to a number of the health conditions that plague us today. So diabetes and obesity and autoimmune diseases and asthma, and there's a whole host of the things that we suffer from today that seem to relate to this extinction, or not extinction, but diminishing ecosystem within us.
And then the reverse, the other side of the coin is, of course, this vision that has somehow come up at the same time, which I think is only obvious, the idea of the world without humans. So at the same time as we have this notion of humans being at the center of the world and is destroying everything, you have the complete opposite, but also the same, which is that at one day we won't be here anymore. We will disappear, but the planet will survive in some form or the other. So it's kind of a one point is man as sovereign. This should probably make us more humble, that we are just a little parentheses in the life of planet Earth. Then the next one is what I call biological life beyond the human scale, which is this wonder of all these organisms. Pardon for those who don't read English here, but it basically says, here's the animal who can live forever, which is this strange little creature which has this peculiar quality that it doesn't age. I mean, maybe it won't live forever, but it doesn't age. And I think that's kind of shows to us humans that there are life out there that is somehow more advanced on some parameters than ours, and should make us question our self-perception of us being the most advanced animal on the planet. Then you have something on a more kind of a sociological scale, these super ant colonies that are developing several places in the world, one in southern Europe, one in Southern America, South US, sorry. Basically ant colonies who are coming together and forming like thousands of square miles of ant colonies. So basically, it's this kind of idea that the biggest civilization on planet Earth are the ants. Corresponding to, I guess, what you were saying about the microbiomes, this is just on a planetary scale, not on an individual body scale. And then kind of a more of the horror aspect of it, this idea of the melting ice that will reveal ancient viruses that will somehow come back and haunt human life. Basically, the deep time of planet Earth taking its revenge on the human. I think these perspectives, basically, some of them horrific, some of them wondrous, is again a way of saying, okay, there is more to life on planet Earth than human beings. And this is where we should start looking, speculating, gaining new knowledge.
Yeah. And I guess that comes back to the notion of strangeness as important as a
Definitely.
view in which that which you thought you knew what was becomes something else again.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
And then a third context, which is man in a cosmic perspective. I mean, I think this blows everyone's mind who is just a little bit curious about what's out there. And we were also talking briefly about it at the introduction. This is kind of the one of the newest maps of the galaxy. And what you're seeing here is not only planet Earth. This is the Milky Way that's here, and it's not that big. It's one of these small ones on a large string, which gives you a sense of the scale that we are living in, and that leads to the next part of this, which is we recently found these other 7 exoplanets that could contain life. It hasn't been proved yet, but as Hanne said, that you said in 25 years we'll find out if there's life on Mars, maybe even sooner, and that will change everything. And I completely agree, and I think this is really a frontier, not only for science, but also for philosophy, for art, whatever field. If there's life anywhere else in the solar system, which there's all sense that there is, the question is just why haven't we seen it yet? Then really I think we will find out how relative the knowledge we have about life really is. And that's something I think that keeps me asking these questions, kind of approaching enigmas in the world of science. And then fourth is coming closer to the human, maybe going back a little, which is this idea of man as, or the world as an ecosystem, going back to some of the early general system theories of the 1920s by Ludwig von Bettalanffy. Basically understanding the world as a system of interacting parts, and not only the biological world, but all worlds. So as you see here in this the figure on the cover of the book, it's both in terms of the mind, it's biology, chemistry, physics, philosophy, culture, and sociology. So this is kind of like the general science of understanding the world as a system. Then some years later, you have what is called second-order cybernetics, which is basically this second version of system theory introduced by Heinz von Förster, called observing system, which is basically the realization that you are part of the system that you observe. There's no neutral point outside of the system. You are actually inside of the system, which then would lead again on to some of the theory of the 60s, like Gregory Bateson's Mind and Nature, or Steps to an Ecology of the Mind, which was the book he wrote before that, which basically suggests a very close relationship between the workings of the brain and the natural world. Then going on to more recent research, you have Lynn Margulis, The Symbiotic Planet, which suggests that evolution needs to be understood in symbiotic principles, that things develop in relationships to each other, that you can't just say that a thing develops all on its own. It's actually the different environments that it is placed in that develops it. And then finally, a book and exhibition like the Multi-Species Salon, suggesting for kind of a experimental coexistence between humans and other living beings, I guess you could say.
If I may add to that, I think one of the interesting things in this kind of contemporary moment relating to these entanglement questions is, why did they disappear, in a sense, or rather, why are we suddenly rediscovering entanglement? Because in a sense it makes sense, right? That seems to be, when you think about it, that's the way it is. Why did it happen like that? Why were the biologists the only ones to stick to ecosystems thinking in a lot of ways? And you can see it, I mean, particularly within the field that I studied within biomedicine, in which the biomedical model of the body as a kind of physiological machine that you could fix almost like a car has structured pretty much most of our health system and the way we even think about our individual health, right? When you go to the hospital, it's divided up into the sections of the body. There's a lung department and a heart department. And, even though it seems intuitively more correct that the systems interact in form of one another. And it's this tension between trying to isolate and pick things apart and integrate them again that we're seeing. And we're in this integrative moment, which is both on a cosmic and a micro, both on a macrocosmic and a microcosmic scale, which is interesting and makes this question of the rediscovery of ideas like that incredibly important, I think.
I agree. And then the last context, which I think actually was what inspired the work in the first place, was that strange ecologies exist and have existed for thousands of years in art and popular culture. So it's not like something that I just took out of my own conceptual brain. It was actually looking at artworks who had worked with these questions in several different contexts. I mean, some of them you could even go back and see these cave paintings from 35,000 BC of a volcano eruption, which is basically a very strange ecology if you are a caveman, going all the way up to 2011, and Lars von Trier's disaster movie Melancholia, which suggests will actually describe how to deal with cosmic disaster. Where I think, especially about this picture, is what I love so much about this scene, more than the film in itself, is the ending where they have to, the three remaining characters that we follow have to decide what to do, facing this inevitable destruction of planet Earth. Is the one sister suggests she wants to have the best wine in the wine cellar and listen to the finest music. So kind of sticking to the cultural conventions that she's inherited as sense-making within the cultural context. While the other sister, the so-called mad sister, realizes that this is a completely different context. Those conventions don't make any sense anymore. And so she decides that they should build this little teepee, which of course doesn't bring any kind of physical protection for the impact of melancholia, but of course will guide some spiritual protection towards this transformation that is about to take place. So within those two examples, further into the future, more recent examples could also have been mentioned. I think it's obvious that there is this curiosity within artistic practices to ask or speculate about the natural world beyond what is known, what is even plausible, and that's actually the field that we want to mine, and in different contexts, coming from different sides. But actually, I think our goal is the same, which was very well formulated by our boss Ken Arnold in his inaugural lecture at the Medical Museum, which is to make a house for the curious. And I think curiosity is really a mode of perception that we are both really keen on, because I think if you nurture it the right way, it can contain both visionary and critical aspects. So with that, Adam, I'll let you go on and talk about some of the examples that you have.
Anyone want to ask any questions now? Or have comments? We can happily talk more, but no? All right. I wanted to show you this picture. So what we're going to do for the remaining time is to give you some examples of these sort of strange ecologies, or ways of interacting with them, or trying to mine, as Jakob says, which I think is a nice geological metaphor for this, that we go with that. I hadn't seen that picture from Melancholia before, but I really like the idea of trying to sort of spiritually manage your environment. I think that's a nice way to.
Which is a practice that has, is very prevalent everywhere outside of the Western world.
Yeah, and you can see it in recent discussions of understandings of health within the kind of contemporary post-industrial health landscape, in which diseases are often these chronic, multifactorial messes, right? Not things that can be cured with pills, even though we try. People have been returning to other notions of health, which is based less on kind of biomarkers or measurable parts of the body, and more about the sort of how well can you manage your environment. Like, health is your ability to manage your environment, whether you're missing a leg or not. It's how you can manage that determines your health. And I think there's something interesting in that correspondence. And speaking of managing, I think this example, which I'd like to talk about as another way of trying to engage with the body rather than from a sort of mechanistic model. This is a guy, Josiah Zahner is his name. He is, at the time the picture is taken, undergoing a radical self-experiment. He's trying to transplant his entire microbiome. He's a biohacker and a kind of tech activist, and he has a long history of gut problems. Right, he has constipation and the reverse of constipation, and all of the physical and mental problems that comes with not having a functioning digestive system, and he's had that since his youth, and it is increasingly. This is 2016, and up to that point, it had increasingly limited his life and been an enormous strain on him. He, at that time, had to go to the bathroom 4 to 5 times a day, often at hours at a time, and no matter which diet he tried to stick to, it didn't impact greatly this kind of everyday life disruption that kind of chronic illness is. If you're ever in doubt that it's nice to have a functioning digestive system, go talk to someone with either irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's. It is a massively disruptive idea. But he had been reading up on the what's called fecal matter transplants, which is a technique that's more and more in use, which is taking shit from healthy people and injecting it into the bowels of sick people in order to kind of rebalance their ecosystem. It's actually clinically being used for treating a variety or several bacterial infections, particularly that of what's called Clostridium difficile, which is a kind of what's called the hospital bacteria. It's a bacteria that gives you chronic diarrhea, kills about 15,000 patients in the US every year, fecal matter transplant is being used clinically to treat that with about I think 90% success rate. Right? They've now in the US and elsewhere made poo banks, like you have blood banks. They sort of where they store healthy shit, and interestingly, it is extremely difficult to find donors. It's basically roughly 1 out of 1,000 people whose internal environment is healthy enough to be a donor for these kind of things. But he wanted to take that idea one step further and try to transplant his entire microbiome. So after after some problems with finding people who would collaborate with him on him, he found a donor. He collected some of his feces. He swabbed the donor's skin and mouth with swabs, and then he went to a hotel room for 4 days, stepping out of his normal microbial environment, because we colonize the world around us with our microbes. Within 24 hours, you can kind of identify who lives in a particular space. So he went to that hotel room, had Clorox wipes, and wiped down all surfaces. He ate antibiotics. He crushed antibiotics and put them in saline and sprayed his skin, which scientists say has no effect. But this is not a strictly scientific experiment. And tried to really cleanse himself of his previous bacteria. And then he ate the feces of his friends in capsules, and he swabbed his mouth and he swabbed his skin with his friend's microbiome to sort of step out, in a sense, of this second skin or this environment and recreate the environment within. Highly dangerous, cannot be recommended in any way, but it steps into a long history of self-experimentation within medicine, which is part of this history. People have done crazy things to themselves for a long time, right?
But what's interesting, I mean, he has obviously a very acute physical problem,
Yes.
but I think what the project also addresses is like what is the identity of a person? Because will he be the same person after he completely changes his microbiome? Who knows? But
well, interesting that there are some answers to that actually, because he came out afterwards. He during the experiment, he sampled his microbiome ongoingly, so before, during, and after, and found out in the analysis that was made after that his new microbiome resembled his donor more. So it wasn't exactly the same, but it resembled his donor more. And he found, anecdotally of course, but his symptoms alleviated significantly, but his diet changed, his food cravings changed. So he'd never eaten cookies before. He began eating cookies. He had been a vegetarian for a long time, but began eating meat and other things. So, and given how much of digestion is a part of our existence in a way, you could say that this ecosystemic shift changed him in a sense, right?
But actually, what I was getting at something more specific, which was actually another artist that you worked with. I don't remember her name, but the artist that
Kathy High,
who asked David Bowie for his feces to kind of take him in and become one with her greatest idol.
Yeah, she really wanted to. She a friend. She had suffered from Crohn's for a long time and really. Thought about this idea with the transplantation. What are you transplanting? And what are you getting? And then a friend of her asked, who do you want to be? And she was like, I want to be David Bowie. And then she made a series of work of herself as David Bowie, which she then sent to Bowie, saying, I've kind of made something for you. Will you make something for me? Then sadly, it was a couple of months before he died, so it never happened. But it shows the kind of strangeness of it is this place in which it's both health, but it's also identity, and it's also nature, and it's also environment, and it's also the way we live, and it's what we eat, and it's all entangled up into one bunch, right? Which has a good dose of strangeness in it.
Should I go on to the next exam? I think you have one more slide. It just shows the stages of...
Yes, yeah, I thought I should have at least one slide with shit on it, just to make sure.
I'm going to show a work that by an artist that I worked with for a recent exhibition called Alienation. Turkish artist called Pınar Yıldız, and her ongoing exhibition, or work, I guess you call it, called An Ecosystem of Excess, dealing with the big sea of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, which I think now is the size of Texas or something more than that. So like a huge sea of plastic. And what's peculiar about it is that it's not like all of it is not detectable objects like flip-flops or bottles or all these kind of defined objects. It's actually microplastics that are the biggest problem. And these microplastics will be digested eventually by the animals who live there, or they are being digested by the animals that live there. And Pınar's work then took this situation as a way to speculate about the kind of life that will evolve in this sea of plastic. And one of the creatures is this little turtle, which builds on research that found out that when we send up balloons into the air, these kind of objects of hope, they somehow, they at some point, of course, they explode and they fall down. And these small objects are really deliciously looking to turtles. And turtles actually eat them quite a lot. With that other peculiar phenomenon that these turtles have some kind of balloon-like shell, and then the work is really trying to imagine the co-evolution of nature and plastic, horrific and beautiful at the same time. But at the same time, she also suggests, not only on the outside, but the inside, she's speculating about these kind of plastic organs, because the animals would be plastivores, and they will have different kind of organs that will be able to both sense, digest, and degrade plastic. This is not sure science, I should say. But the idea is basically that we are mingling with something, or we are generating processes, the extent and the end of which we have no idea. And this is kind of I guess a work you can see that speculates about how one such possible route in the era of plastic, the Plasticine, which is another word, I guess, for the Anthropocene. I mean, plastic is not going away from planet Earth; it's staying. All plastic that was ever produced is still here. So in that way, that's one way that nature and culture is becoming one. And I could talk more about this, but Adam, I think we only have so much time left, so I'll let you go to the next.
Henry, we have about 5 minutes left or so? It's 10 minutes, oceans of time. I just want to give one more example of these sort of strange ecologies and some of the research being done on that now. This is a swarm of locusts. And I don't know if you know this, but these two could be the same organism. Right? So in normal circumstances, desert locusts look like the one on the left, solitary, slow, cautious creatures. But if ecosystemic pressures mount on them, if there are scarcity of food, if they become too many in an individual, they go through a transformation which is driven by epigenetic changes. So changes that are not that aren't changing their DNA, but the way in which their DNA is being expressed on a kind of hourly level, and they turn into the creatures on the right and become these huge, massive swarms. Their feeding behavior, their learning patterns, their social behaviors, everything about them change due to epigenetic shifts, right? So it's the same organism with the same DNA, but acting completely differently. And I wanted to bring up this notion of epigenetics because it's one of the horizons of biomedical research right now, which is adding to this sense of strangeness. Here is an example from some of the researchers which we, from the research center which I work with, which is a study done on, which basically showed that we're used to thinking of the kind of DNA as being delivered through the sperm. So the man has his part of his DNA is kind of transferred through the sperm, and that's a kind of unchanging thing, right? You pass on your genetic inheritance. It's my DNA. It is unchanging. This is what I give to you. But what this research showed was that epigenetic factors, which are factors that has to do with how these genes are expressed, right? So in a sense, a kind of modulating the strength to which different parts of that genome be expressed, are actually containing a kind of snapshot of the state of the body. So he examined the sperm of men before and after weight loss and found changes within the epigenetic expression in areas of the genome relating to both brain development and function, but also to areas that has to do with metabolism and digestion, suggesting then that the sperm contains a kind of environmental snapshot of the state of the body. And what is so interesting about, and why I find the strangeness of epigenetics, is that suddenly evolution is not this stationary, immutable thing, and the environment is a biochemical reality. And there's a whole host of other things, like they show that rats who are nursed by their mothers have epigenetic changes relating to stress hormones, right? So the touch of the mother, the kind of social cultural value of that becomes embedded in a kind of molecular way. They've managed to transfer in rats aversion to particular smells in generations. So they took rats and they gave them a kind of cherry-like smell and then gave them a zap, and then in 2 generations following that, the rats had, the offspring had an adverse relationship to that smell. Right? So suddenly the boundary between nature and culture, between body and environment, are completely meshed. So in a sense, you're a 100% gene and 100% environment, which I think is a wonderfully strange thing.
And only 50% human.
Yes.
The last example that I'll show is kind of going on the large scale. It's also an exhibit from a show that I did also from the Alienation show. And it's basically a piece of meteorite that impacted in the city where the biennial was taking place. The meteorite is peculiar in more than one way. One way is that it fell through a roof and melted the isolation in the roof. So what you see here is not meteorite. This is melted rock wool, I guess you call it. So in a way, it's very concretely an object where man-made materiality and cosmic materiality come together. But more than that, I'm also just stunned by meteorites in general. Working in disaster studies, I talked a lot about meteorites as one of the great extinction scenarios, but also life-generating scenarios. 60 tons of meteorites fall on Earth each year, so that's quite a big amount. And I guess you could say, to some extent, this is the most alien object you can imagine. It's coming from outer space. Some people speculate that the fungi that was part of creating human life came on one such stone. Who knows? So maybe it's actually the alien within us coming from outside. And I just really love to include a piece like this in an exhibition. I mean, it's not, I guess, it's not an artwork as such, but it's really an object of wonder that makes you not only ask about yourself, but also the place of mankind in a much larger context, which is the cosmos. And I think these are the questions we should start asking ourselves more and more. We asked them in the 60s, somehow in the 70s, but then the space colony program died down and we stopped really having any interest in outer space. Then Mars came, but that's more like turned into a TV show opportunity, I guess some would say. Yeah. But the cosmos as a horizon for our perception and knowledge, I think, is highly relevant.
Yeah. And interestingly, the last revival of our interest in bacteria as something, as a kind of from an ecosystemic view, also happened in the mid-late 60s. There was a very popular book called Life on Man, which was published at that time, and then that died out again.
Before or after Bowie wrote Life on Mars?
Before.
Okay, and then I guess we will end with this question, which is what is guiding us as we work. What curatorial approaches, practices, and strategies do strange ecologies inspire to? We've given some idea. I think a basic premise is that we need to work transdisciplinary. We need to work. Yeah, what do we need? We need to keep wondering. Chase the enigmas of the natural world, to keep expanding our mindset. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add? I think really forcing, like, not really just, I don't know.
I see questions popping up.
Yeah, please
Please fire away.